Welcome back to Section 2 of Module 1, where we're going to begin by analyzing different import business models. Let's jump right in. We're going to start off with some general definitions that we hope will establish the foundation of much of what we're going to talk about moving forward. In general terms, let's start off with this idea of a business model. What does it mean? Well, really, it's the way in which a company creates value, generates revenues, incurs expenses, and makes a profit. Admittedly, a pretty simplistic definition, but it allows us the flexibility as we move forward to look at different types of import models. In the end, it's about a value proposition, what a company does to attract customers, to generate sales, incur expenses as a natural consequence of those sales, and in the end, hopefully make a profit. A key point we do want to make is that the core business model, what a company does, has a considerable impact on the design, execution, and measurement of an import program. As we'll see in just a couple of moments, a core business model, let's say a retailer of fashion goods versus an importer of raw materials that manufactures industrial goods, two different things, two different models that require different tactics in an import program. That's all we mean. That's what we're trying to establish here. Let's run through some examples specifically of import business models. Let's start off with the most traditional, a US-based manufacturer who actually makes things in the United States, but they import raw materials, components, sub-assemblies, bring in lots of stuff from overseas. Maybe they buy raw materials domestically here in the United States as well, but we're talking about a U.S. manufacturer that imports its raw materials, produces, and then sells. As a subset of that description, how about a U.S.-based manufacturer that operates in a foreign trade zone? Don't be worried if you're not familiar with FTZs, as they're called. We'll get into more detail on those as we proceed. But companies that operate in a foreign trade zone have permission from U.S. Customs and Border Protection to import raw materials into the foreign trade zone, which is where the factory is located, not pay customs duties on those raw materials, go into production, create finished goods, and then either introduce those finished goods into the commerce of the United States at a lower or completely eliminated duty rate, or export those goods without ever having to worry about paying customs duties in the United States. FTZ manufacturing, very interesting model. We'll see more examples of that in the future. Some more examples. Wholesalers that import finished goods ready to sell, typically in a wide variety of items for a specific industry, that resell to other companies or individuals. Plumbing supplies, as an example. A wholesaler, they're not dealing with raw materials. They're not making anything. They're that middle person that brings in merchandise ready to go, usually carries lots and lots of different items, lots of SKUs, stock keeping units, within a specific industry. Of course, the retailer that we know so well here in the United States and abroad would have come to be known as brick and mortar operators, actual stores that people go to. That's an import business model that has specific requirements. Might be a clothing store, might be a home improvement store, doesn't matter. They're a retailer. There are certain tactics that can be used to enhance supply chain performance. Conversely, companies that were founded in the internet age that decide not to become retailers, not to own stores, only to sell online, an e-commerce seller, an e-tailer, as it's referred to. Different model, different requirements from a supply chain perspective, from an inbound logistics perspective. And then, of course, to use a term that's quite popular these days, omni-channel retailer, where a company will sell goods online. They will have retail stores. They'll have a sales force taking orders from customers, multiple ways in which they sell and distribute goods. Very different from a manufacturing, wholesaler, and even an e-commerce environment, because there are different ways in which goods are sold and different ways in which demand signals are sent up the supply chain. Tier 1, 2, or 3 supplier. This terminology comes from the automotive industry, definitely in a manufacturing environment where the supplier who sells to an auto manufacturer, Ford, GM, BMW, etc., that vendor that sells goods, let's say seats ready to be installed in a car, that's a tier 1 supplier. The supplier who sells directly to the tier 1 guy or lady is the tier 2 vendor. So different types of raw materials that go into production that ultimately the tier 1 supplier uses to create something that's ready to be installed in a product. We use the automotive example because that's where the example came from. Agricultural importer, different ballgame entirely. Foodstuffs, perishables that are subject here in the United States not only to Customs and Border Protection, but PGAs, partner government agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife, etc. Agricultural importers have their own type of import concerns to deal with because it's a different import model. And then, of course, and we have a great example of this in just one moment, marketing and merchandising firms. That they don't make anything, they outsource their production and focus on core competencies like product development, sales and marketing, and taking care of their customers. Let's talk about one of those examples right now. Before we look at the topic at hand, we're going to introduce a couple of concepts here that we'll use throughout all of our sections, all of our modules. To bring our supply chain, our import story to life, we're going to use as many real-world scenarios as we possibly can. The more general ones we'll refer to as a supply chain perspective. The more specific ones we call real-world examples, oddly enough. The first you're seeing here is a supply chain perspective. The intent of both is to really help illustrate key concepts, key points that we're trying to make through actual goings-on, actual practices out in the marketplace. If you do all modules that we offer in the import program, you will see hundreds of these. Let's start off with a story about Nike. One of the best examples of a marketing, merchandising, import model, of course, is Nike. As a company who bills itself, and this is their words, the world's leader in sports, if you read their annual reports, last 2, 3, 4, 5 more annual reports, it's very consistent. The company concentrates on 3 things. Product innovation, coming up with great products that people are willing to pay for. A customer-centric culture where everybody focuses on those customer needs, and supply chain execution, just like we saw in section 1 when we quoted Louis V. Gerstner from IBM, the ability to create competitive advantage through supply chain execution. Interesting to note, of equal importance in these annual reports is what Nike doesn't talk about, manufacturing. It's a different model. They don't make much of anything. So given the above objectives, Nike chooses to outsource its manufacturing, fundamentally impacting how it imports goods. It outsources manufacturing to over 700 vendors, and within that framework, the company emphasizes collaboration with supply chain partners, channel partners, as CSCMP refers to them as, all the way from product concept, an idea in somebody's mind, through delivery, speed to market, and ethical sourcing. Clearly, as an importer, this type of model compels Nike to not only outsource manufacturing, but other things too. It's logistics, working with 3PLs, third-party logistics companies, to contribute to the quality of their supply chain. At the end of the day, their success depends not only upon developing those great products, but working with supply chain partners, integrating the theme of this entire module, integrating with supply chain partners to do what? The 4 objectives that we've spoken of. Maximize sales, drive down landed cost, stabilize lead time, and optimize its considerable investment in inventory, which by definition is finished goods because they don't really make very much. The title of this slide, How Business Models Influence Inventory Management and Purchasing, the whole idea of integration. Because as we defined, inventory management is really the essence of supply chain, but we won't have much to manage in terms of inventory if we don't acquire that inventory, if we don't purchase that inventory. So a good example of integration between purchasing and inventory management. A specific model, of course, is going to determine the types or different classes of inventory that we carry. And we're talking about finished goods versus raw materials. Very important point here. Fundamental is that one of the biggest distinctions to be made in any business model is related to manufacturing, a strategic decision. Are we going to make goods ourselves, in-house manufacturing, or are we going to outsource our manufacturing? That decision, that make or buy decision, is going to dramatically impact how and what we import. As such, that decision, in-house versus outsource, is also going to determine the types of inventory that an importer carries. This is the slide that we said we'd be seeing a lot of. So we're not here to disappoint. Let's talk about it and use it right now. As you'll note from the title, in this context, the supply chain implications of in-house, that's bolded in red, versus outsourced manufacturing. So we're talking about how supply chains look, how inventory types are determined based on an in-house model. Regardless of the model, we want to be taking our demand signals from customers, but first, starting out with a forecast. We always want to be sensitive to demand signals from customers, actual purchases, but in the beginning of a period, a 1-year tactical supply chain period, we are going to be relying, at least on the front end, on forecasts. How we adjust between forecasted demand and actual demand is a big part of supply chain. Right now, we're talking about in-house manufacturing. How do we get demand signals up the supply chain into our manufacturing environment, bearing in mind that because we're a manufacturer, we have to be dealing with raw material suppliers, many of whom are going to be located overseas, buying raw materials, components, sub-assemblies, etc. What quantities do we buy? When do we buy them? How do lead times from a vendor in Indonesia impact the needs of a factory in Indianapolis, Indiana? All of these considerations are our responsibility in an in-house manufacturing environment and fundamentally influence the characteristics of our inbound supply chain. From demand signals on the sell side, back up the supply chain into materials management on the buy side of the supply chain. Conversely, what does our supply chain look like? We changed our red bolding to an outsourced environment where, sure, we're still dealing with forecasts and demand signals, but we're not the manufacturer. We're not dealing with raw materials vendors. So how do we deal with that natural split between buy-side and sell-side activities in an outsourced environment and convey demand signals over a period of time to our outsourced manufacturing partners? There are many advantages to outsourcing. We're not here to say that there aren't. What we will say emphatically is that because we're not manufacturing ourselves, there is a divide right down the middle between the buy side of the supply chain and the sell side, and how do we manage that even though we're not responsible, air quotes emphasized, for dealing with raw material suppliers or manufacturing. Different ballgame from a supply chain perspective. Continuing on with this theme, after talking about in-house versus outsourced manufacturing, how business models influence inventory management and purchasing. Well, hopefully we can see that the business model, now defined, also influences upstream supply chain strategies, things we do way before we start buying raw materials, for example, such as sourcing. We have a whole module on sourcing, upwards of 6 hours, so we're not going to talk too much about it now, but it's that strategic complementary activity to purchasing, where we're looking at where to buy goods, what countries to source from, what's the manufacturing infrastructure in a country, what's the landed cost environment look like, what are the lead times, strategic decisions long before purchasing ever takes place. So clearly, what we do as a company is going to impact our sourcing activities. Second bullet, purchasing strategies by definition have to be linked to the manufacturing model, inventory policies, and maybe sourcing constraints at origin. An example of a sourcing constraint being only certain products can be bought in specific countries. There's a constraint there. Can't get a certain product everywhere around the world. Third bullet, business models and practices of the trade. Traditions of a given industry will also weigh heavily on purchasing and inventory management activities. A quick example of practices of the trade, smaller retailers or e-tailers who buy finished goods from vendors overseas. A practice of the trade, certainly in China, is that when a purchase order is placed on a vendor, the practice of the trade is a 30% down payment is made for the goods. When the finished goods are tendered to a forwarder at origin, maybe another 30% is made, and then the balance upon arrival at the United States. That's just an example and an illustration of what we mean by a practice of the trade. We'll see lots of those in our real-world examples. This is the last slide in the current section, and it is entitled Business Models and Types of Inventory Carried. We've made some references to different types of inventory, but we want to be thorough and make sure that everyone is aware of the different types of inventory that is out there, driven by the business model. Let's wrap things up by saying that classes of inventory will definitely vary based on the model. If we're a manufacturer, we're buying goods overseas for manufacturing, we need raw materials, components, subassemblies. We manufacture, we have to deal with raw materials. If we manufacture, we also have to deal with work in process, which are goods that have gone into a production environment, but they're not done yet. Finished goods, that e-tailer, that retailer. Nike, to go back to our example, they're buying finished goods overseas. They're not dealing with production, at least directly. They're selling finished goods. Distribution inventory, as the name would indicate, are goods that are out in a distribution channel but haven't gotten to the final user yet. A company in the United States might have 4 DCs, big DCs around the country, with a dozen satellite DCs in specific geographic areas. Goods that are in a DC, goods that are in a satellite fulfillment house, that's distribution inventory. Accessories, replacement parts for products that are sold out in the marketplace, replacement parts for refrigerators, as an example. That's a type of inventory. Spare parts, a little bit different, going back to a manufacturing scenario, where a company that is a manufacturer needs spare parts for the machines they use to produce the actual goods. And then finally, maintenance, repair, and operation, once again in a manufacturing environment, MRO, as it is sometimes called. This is inventory that we need as a manufacturer to maintain our machinery, our equipment, cleaning solvents, the rags that are used to clean equipment, all of the inventory we need to repair and basically operate production equipment, it's MRO. We want to establish the different types of inventories, the different classes of inventories, to make it easier to talk about these models as we move forward. So that's it for the current section. When we come back, we'll talk about business models and manufacturing and purchasing strategies. Please come back soon.